The sun dipped low over the manicured lawns of an affluent suburban street, casting long shadows across the pavement as General Michael Adams strolled in quiet solitude. Clad in a plain white t-shirt and jeans, he blended into the stillness of the late afternoon, exuding a calm strength from years of military service. This walk was his sanctuary, a peaceful ritual in a neighborhood he had called home for years. But to Officer James Davis, circling the block in his patrol car, Michael's presence wasn't calming. It was suspicious. Davis's eyes narrowed as they locked onto the lone black man walking through the pristine streets. In his 10 years on the force, Davis had learned to trust his instincts, instincts shaped not by facts, but by fear, by bias, by an unspoken rule. People like him didn't belong here. As Davis slowed to a crawl, his gaze never left Michael. The engine purred. The air inside the car grew heavy. Michael turned slightly, catching the officer's stare, his expression unreadable but calm. That composure, that ease, it irritated Davis. To him, it didn't matter that the man was doing nothing wrong. He didn't recognize him, and that alone was enough to set off the alarm bells in his mind. Who was this man walking so confidently in a place where, in Davis's view, confidence was a privilege not freely granted? The patrol car pulled to the curb with a sudden halt. Davis stepped out, adjusting his belt, his fingers brushing against his holster as a subtle assertion of power. Michael continued walking, unfazed, until Davis's voice cut through the stillness like a blade. "Hey, you there?" Michael stopped, turned slowly, and faced him. His stance was relaxed but steady, his voice calm. "Yes, officer. Is there a problem?" The tension crackled like static in the summer air. Davis scanned him up and down, searching for a reason, any reason, to justify what he already believed. "What are you doing here?" "I'm taking a walk," Michael replied, his tone steady. "I live just a few blocks away." But Davis didn't hear the words. He heard defiance. He saw a man who wasn't afraid, and that frightened him more than any crime ever could. "Show me some ID," Davis barked, stepping closer, his voice laced with unearned authority. Michael sighed, not out of guilt, but exhaustion. He had been here before, not this exact street, not this exact cop, but this exact moment. The quiet interrogation that begins with suspicion and often ends with injustice. Slowly, he reached for his wallet, his movements deliberate, controlled. He handed over his ID without a word. Davis glanced at the address. It was local. The name, Michael Adams. Something didn't feel right, but instead of stepping back, Davis leaned further in, because this wasn't about safety. This was about control. And in that moment, Davis had already decided. Truth didn't matter. Perception did. And perception for men like Michael was a battlefield of its own. Michael Adams had faced many tense moments in his life, on the battlefield, in war rooms, under pressure most civilians could never imagine. But nothing had prepared him for the indignity he now endured under the setting sun, in the very neighborhood where he had once found peace. The ID had been real. The address was his. The explanation, calm, logical, respectful, had been offered. Yet none of it mattered. Officer James Davis stood unmoved, a storm of distrust boiling behind his narrowed eyes, as if truth itself were an inconvenience. The general's voice had remained measured, but it was clear now. Davis wasn't listening. This wasn't a conversation. It was a confrontation, not about crime, but about control. "I'm not resisting, officer," Michael said evenly, "but I also know my rights. I've done nothing wrong." Davis's jaw "I'll decide what's wrong and what's right," he snapped. And with that, he reached forward, seized Michael by the arm, and twisted it behind his back. The cold bite of metal followed, handcuffs snapping closed around the wrists of a man who had served his country with distinction, now treated like a trespasser in his own community. Michael tensed, not from fear, but from restraint. His military training told him he could end this in seconds. But his wisdom warned him of the cost. One wrong move and this could spiral into tragedy. Around them, the quiet street had come alive with stunned eyes. A woman walking her dog had stopped, phone in hand, recording. A man watering his lawn let the hose slip from his fingers, the water pooling on the sidewalk, forgotten. Neighbors peered through windows, drawn by the tension but paralyzed by it. Michael saw it all, the disbelief, the hesitation, the silence. Would any of them speak? Would anyone step forward to say, "This isn't right"? No. They watched, some out of curiosity, some out of guilt. But no one moved. Davis shoved him toward the patrol car, each step echoing with humiliation. "Get in," he barked. Michael ducked his head and slid into the back seat, cuffs biting into his skin. Through the window, he could see the woman still filming, her hand trembling. Part of him hoped it would be enough, that someone, somewhere, would see what happened here and understand that injustice didn't always come with flashing headlines or broken bones. Sometimes it came quiet and cold, hidden beneath the badge of law. The door slammed shut and the patrol car rolled away. In the silence, Michael sat straight, his back against the seat, eyes steady. He had done nothing wrong, but that hadn't protected him. Not his rank, not his record, not his dignity. In that moment, the stars on his shoulders meant nothing. What mattered now wasn't what he'd endured, but what he would do next. Because this wasn't just about him. This was about a system, and the long, hard road to change. The holding room was silent, except for the faint hum of fluorescent lights and the rhythmic ticking of a clock on the wall. General Michael Adams sat alone, hands cuffed, wrists aching, but his composure unshaken. His breathing was slow, measured, every inhale a battle against the insult burning beneath his skin. He had commanded men in war zones, negotiated peace in foreign lands, and carried the weight of entire battalions. But here, in a small, stale room, he was reduced to nothing more than a suspicious black man. That truth stung more than the cuffs ever could. He had done everything right, and still, he had been stripped of dignity by a man clinging to the illusion of control. Then the door opened. Sergeant Laura Smith entered, crisp uniform, steady eyes, and an air of authority that didn't need force to be felt. She scanned the room, her gaze pausing on Michael, then darting to Officer Davis, who stood rigid with a poorly concealed mix of defensiveness and dread. "What's going on here?" she asked flatly. Davis cleared his throat, found him walking in an upscale neighborhood, acting suspicious. "I asked for ID. He refused to cooperate." Michael didn't flinch. "I gave him my ID, told him I lived nearby." Smith turned to Davis, eyes narrowing. "Did you run his ID?" "Yes. It came back clean. But you still cuffed him?" Davis hesitated. "I was doing my job." Smith's jaw tensed. She stepped forward and placed Michael's ID on the table. "This man is a high-ranking general in the United States Army," she said quietly, but with steel in her tone. "You brought him in without cause. You humiliated him in public, in handcuffs." "I didn't know who he was," Davis muttered. "And that," Smith snapped, "is exactly the problem." The air grew heavier. Michael stood slowly, the metal cuffs clinking with finality. "Sergeant," he said evenly, "this isn't just about me. This is about how people like Officer Davis exercise their duty, not to protect, but to control." Smith nodded, the words landing with weight. "You're absolutely right, and this stops now." She turned to Davis. "Release him. Immediately." Davis fumbled with the keys, hands shaking. The cuffs came off with a click, but the damage had been done. Michael rubbed his wrists, not to ease the pain, but to reclaim what had been taken, his humanity. He looked Davis in the eye, calm but firm. "You saw a threat when there wasn't one. You judged me before a word was spoken. Let that sink in." Smith gestured toward the door. "General Adams, would you join me in my office? We need to make this right." As Michael walked past the stunned officer, something shifted, not just in that room, but in the foundation of the department itself. Because justice, long overdue, had finally found its voice, and it wore no badge, only integrity. The tension in Sergeant Laura Smith's office clung to the walls like humidity before a storm. Outside, murmurs rippled through the station, officers whispering, glancing toward the closed door behind which something long overdue was finally happening. Inside, General Michael Adams sat composed, but every inch of his posture spoke of a man who had endured just enough to remain calm, but never enough to stop fighting. Across from him, Sergeant Smith leaned forward, her pen paused above a nearly full page of notes, each word a witness to the reckoning that had just begun. "Officer Davis," she said firmly, "is hereby suspended, effective immediately." The words dropped like a gavel strike. It wasn't just disciplinary, it was symbolic. Davis, once brimming with false authority, had left the office moments before, his shoulders sunken, his silence louder than any protest. Michael had watched him go, not with triumph, but with purpose. Because this was never about personal vengeance. It was about exposing a rot that had festered beneath the surface for far too long. Sergeant Smith exhaled slowly. "I want you to know, General, that this isn't how we operate. But I won't pretend this is an isolated case. It's not, and we're going to face that head on." Michael nodded, his voice calm but unwavering. "It's not about one officer. It's about a mindset. The fact that Davis felt empowered to do what he did, to arrest a man walking in his own neighborhood, despite proof, says more about the culture you've built than any training manual ever could." Smith's expression didn't shift, but her eyes glistened with something rare in conversations like this: humility. She had spent years trying to uphold justice, but now she had to confront the uncomfortable truth. Her department, like many, had failed in ways that were invisible until someone like Michael was dragged into a cell. "We're initiating an internal investigation," she said. "But more than that, we're overhauling how we train our officers. Every member of this department will attend mandatory training on racial bias, de-escalation, and cultural competency. It won't be a checkbox. It'll be the foundation." Michael leaned forward, meeting her gaze. "That's a start, but training without accountability is just theory. What matters is action, consequences, and leadership that doesn't look away when things get uncomfortable." Smith nodded. "Agreed, and that leadership starts with me. We're not just suspending Davis, we're changing the rules that allow Davis to exist." For the first time in days, Michael felt the stirrings of hope, not the kind born from apologies or PR statements, but from sincerity backed by action. As Smith reached across the desk and offered her hand, he took it, not in forgiveness, but in commitment. The battle was far from over, but today a wall had cracked, and through it light had begun to pour in. Word spread fast. By morning, the whispers had evolved into a reckoning that echoed through every corridor of the precinct. Officer James Davis's desk sat empty, its silence louder than any gunshot, its absence a symbol of accountability, finally catching up with power unchecked. The arrest of General Michael Adams had shattered more than protocol. It fractured the illusion that bias was a thing of the past. Officers huddled in break rooms, talking in hushed tones. Some defended Davis with weak shrugs. Others, like Officer Ramirez, sat quietly, staring at the cracked screen of his department-issued laptop, suddenly questioning everything he thought he knew about justice, duty, and the badge he wore. Later that day, the mandatory training sessions began, not as optional seminars, but as critical interventions. Ramirez found himself in a room with colleagues who'd all seen the footage. A man walking in his own neighborhood, calm, composed, handcuffed for daring not to shrink under suspicion. At the front of the room, a community relations officer spoke not of law, but of empathy. "Implicit bias isn't a concept," she said. "It's a habit, and if you don't see it, you're not looking." Ramirez had always believed himself fair. He followed procedures, treated people with respect. But as the facilitator played back audio from the Michael Adams stop, the firm, even voice of a general being overruled by suspicion, Ramirez felt something inside him twist. He'd seen men like Adams before, calm, composed, and yet, somewhere deep down, he too had once wondered, why is he here? That question had never sounded dangerous, until now. After the session, Ramirez found Sergeant Smith in the hallway. She was tired, the fatigue visible in the tension around her eyes, but her presence radiated something stronger than exhaustion: resolve. "These trainings," he said softly, "they're working. People are talking, thinking." She turned to him, offering a small but tired smile. "That's how it starts, Beto. Not with a speech, with reflection, with discomfort." Ramirez nodded. "I've judged people before I spoke to them. Maybe not like Davis, but I'm not innocent." Smith placed a hand on his shoulder. "None of us are, but realizing it, that's the work. That's how we get better." The hallway remained still as Ramirez walked away, thoughts churning. Davis's suspension wasn't just a punishment, it was a signal. The culture was shifting. The badge would still mean authority, but now it needed to mean something more: accountability, humanity, self-awareness. General Adams's arrest had exposed a wound the department had long ignored, and in that pain was a possibility, a rare chance to rebuild not just rules but values. And for the first time, Ramirez didn't fear the discomfort. He welcomed it, because growth never came from silence. It came from facing the truth, no matter how hard it was to hear. The community center was packed, shoulder to shoulder, with residents, officers, activists, and families who had heard the story, watched the video, and could no longer stay silent. Folding chairs creaked beneath weight, not just of people, but of questions, raw, unspoken, burning for answers. At the front of the room stood General Michael Adams, no longer in handcuffs, no longer confined to a cell, but now facing a different kind of battlefield. The battle for trust, for understanding, for dignity that should never have been questioned in the first place. He took a breath, steadying himself not from fear, but from the gravity of what this moment could mean. "What happened to me," he began, his voice clear and resonant, "was humiliating. But it was not unique, and that's why we're here." The room fell into a hush. He recounted the walk, the questions, the handcuffs, how he had done everything right, and still it hadn't mattered. "I wasn't seen as a neighbor. I was seen as a threat, not because of my actions, but because of my skin." His words cut through the air like truth through fog, unflinching, undeniable. An elderly man in the front row raised his hand, voice shaking. "General Adams, I've lived in that neighborhood 35 years. I never thought something like this could happen so close. How do we stop it from happening again?" Michael's reply was slow, deliberate. "We start by being honest about our biases, about our silence, and about the systems we uphold, even when they hurt the people they're supposed to protect." A young woman at the back stood, emotion thick in her throat. "What can we do as regular people?" "Get involved," Michael said without pause. "Attend forums like this. Speak up when you see injustice, and don't wait for someone else to lead the change. Be the one who starts it." Sergeant Laura Smith stepped forward, standing beside him, not as an officer defending her department, but as a leader willing to rebuild it. "We're changing," she said. "Training is mandatory. Policies are being reviewed. But we can't do this alone. We need you to hold us accountable. We need transparency, and we need dialogue, like this." The crowd murmured, then nodded. Slowly, resistance turned to reflection. Divisions softened into unity. As the forum continued, what began as a moment of outrage evolved into a movement of purpose. Neighbors shared stories, officers listened without interruption, and lines once drawn in fear began to blur. For the first time in a long while, the room didn't feel like two sides. It felt like one community, daring to believe in something better. And as Michael stepped off the stage, he was surrounded, not by suspicion, but by handshakes, gratitude, and eyes that now saw him not as different, but as a leader. The fight for change was far from over, but tonight they had taken the first step, together. It was a crisp morning, and the autumn breeze carried the scent of turning leaves and fresh beginnings. General Michael Adams stepped out onto the tree-lined sidewalk, the same street where just weeks earlier he had been handcuffed like a criminal in front of his neighbors. But today felt different. The air held a quiet grace, the kind that whispered, "Not everything is healed, but something has begun." As he walked, boots crunching over amber leaves, a small group of children ran past him laughing. One of them turned back, gave him a shy wave, and called out, "Good morning, sir." His heart stirred, because respect given freely was a kind of justice, too. He rounded the corner and saw her, a woman with a golden retriever who had once looked away when he was detained. This time, she didn't avoid him. She smiled, her eyes holding a softness he hadn't seen before. "Morning, General Adams," she said. "Beautiful day, isn't it?" "It is," he replied, tipping his head. And it truly was. Then came the patrol car. The familiar hum of tires on pavement once triggered something tight in his chest. But as the car slowed, he recognized the driver, Officer Ramirez. The young officer rolled down the window, no stiffness in his shoulders, no suspicion in his eyes, only sincerity. "Good morning, General," Ramirez greeted, his voice calm and open. "How are you today?" Michael offered a gentle smile. "I'm well, Officer Ramirez. Out enjoying the peace." Ramirez nodded. "Glad to hear it. If you ever need anything, just know we're here to serve." It wasn't performative. It wasn't rehearsed. It was real. And Michael could feel it. "Thank you," he replied, the two men exchanging a look that said more than words ever could. Mutual recognition, shared accountability, hope. As the car drove off, Michael continued his walk, past homes with windows no longer shuttered in judgment. Neighbors who once turned away now waved, said hello, even crossed the street to speak. One man offered fresh coffee, another shook his hand. It wasn't redemption, because Michael had never been the one who needed redeeming. It was acknowledgement. And that, in its own quiet way, was revolutionary. Later that day at the precinct, Sergeant Laura Smith welcomed him into her office. Her updates were firm, direct. Davis had been formally dismissed. New training protocols were already underway, and officers were showing signs of real change, measured not in checkboxes, but in conversations, in posture, in presence. "It's working," she said. "Not everywhere, not overnight, but it's working." Michael nodded, his gaze steady. "Then we keep going. We stay loud. We stay visible. Because dignity is not something given. It's something no one should ever be allowed to take." And as he left the station, walking once more under the golden trees, Michael felt the shift, not just in others, but in the very soil beneath his feet. Something was growing. And for the first time in a long while, this neighborhood felt like home. The hum of fluorescent lights in Sergeant Laura Smith's office was the only sound as General Michael Adams stepped inside once more, this time not as a suspect, not as a victim, but as a catalyst for change. The air between them was different now, not cleared of tension, but dense with purpose. Smith stood as he entered, offering a firm handshake, one professional to another, one leader to another. No pretense, no apology, just mutual resolve. "Thank you for coming, General," she said. "Please have a seat. I have updates." Michael sat, his posture upright, his expression calm but alert. He'd heard these types of conversations before, too many times, where the promises were smooth, the words were polished, but the action never came. But today, something in Smith's tone made him listen a little closer. "Officer Davis has been formally dismissed," she began. "The investigation confirmed multiple policy violations. Now, it wasn't just poor judgment, it was a breach of everything we stand for. He's gone." Michael didn't smile, didn't gloat. He simply nodded. "That's the right call," he said. "But you know this isn't just about Davis." Smith nodded, meeting his gaze without flinching. "That's why I asked you here. We've launched a full department-wide reform. All officers are now required to attend monthly workshops, not just on de-escalation, but on cultural awareness, implicit bias, and accountability. We're holding regular community meetings. We're reviewing every stop-and-search policy line by line." Michael leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "Training is essential, but changing policies doesn't change hearts. Culture is what we tolerate, what we look away from. If that doesn't shift, this will all just be surface." Smith exhaled slowly, absorbing his words. "You're right, and I won't pretend this will be easy, but I've seen the conversations beginning, officers reflecting, some admitting they've made judgments without even realizing it. It's a start." Michael nodded again, this time slower. "I've walked these streets and seen the difference. Neighbors speak now. Officers greet me with respect, not suspicion. That's not coincidence. That's momentum." Smith smiled faintly, the kind that carried exhaustion and hope in equal measure. "You've been the catalyst, General. What happened to you, what you endured, forced us all to look in the mirror." He shook his head. "What I endured happens to others every day. The only difference is I had the title that made people listen. But titles shouldn't be what protect us. Our humanity should." Silence hung between them, heavy, sacred. "We're going to keep going," Smith said, voice steady, "not just to repair what was broken, but to build something better." Michael stood, extended his hand once more. "Then let's make sure we never forget why we started." As they shook hands, the weight of the past began to transform into something new. Not closure, but commitment. Because change didn't end with a dismissal. It started with what came next. And they both knew the real work was just beginning. Whispers had turned into conversations. Conversations had sparked reform. But what followed was the most powerful shift of all: self-reflection. Within the walls of the police department, where silence once masked complicity, there was now a buzz, a hum of reckoning. Officer Ramirez, once certain he understood the badge he wore, found himself attending yet another training session. But this one was different. It wasn't just slides and slogans, it was personal. As an instructor from the community relations team spoke about implicit bias, Ramirez sat still, his jaw tight. The words cut deep, not because they accused him, but because they described him. The quiet assumptions, the unspoken judgments, the times he'd crossed the street when he didn't need to. He'd never cuffed a general, but had he treated that black teenager with fairness last summer? Did he give that single mother the same patience as he would a businessman in a suit? The screen flickered. The image froze on a single frame. Michael Adams in handcuffs, his gaze defiant yet heartbreakingly composed. Ramirez looked away, not from guilt, but from clarity. After the session, he found Sergeant Smith in the hallway. She was holding a stack of reports, exhaustion etched into the lines beneath her eyes. "These sessions," he said, his voice softer than usual, "they're working. I heard Jenkins apologize to a resident the other day, sincerely. That never used to happen." Smith gave him a faint smile. "It's not perfection, Ramirez. It's progress." Meanwhile, across town, Michael Adams was no longer just a name in a police file. He had become a movement. Invitations flooded in. Local councils, church forums, high school assemblies. People didn't just want to hear about the injustice, they wanted to learn how not to repeat it. One evening, Michael stood at the front of a packed church, rows of pews filled with residents, black, white, Latino, Asian, listening with open hearts. "Real change," he said, "doesn't come from titles or viral videos. It comes from what we do after the camera stops rolling, when we choose to speak up instead of stand by, when we train not just our minds but our character." Back at the precinct, a notice appeared, "Community Dialogue Circle, open to all officers. Attendance encouraged." To Ramirez's surprise, nearly everyone showed up. That night, he saw something he hadn't seen before: officers listening. Not debating, not defending, just listening. Michael's arrest had begun as a disgrace, but in the ripples of that pain, the department found its reckoning. And in neighborhoods where fear once shadowed sidewalks, now came waves, nods, conversations. It wasn't over, it never would be. But for the first time in a long while, the people and the police were walking in the same direction, together. The community center was overflowing. Rows of folding chairs lined the wide hall, filled with residents whose hearts carried a mixture of hope, anger, and cautious curiosity. They had seen the footage. They had read the headlines. But tonight wasn't about judgment. It was about truth. At the front stood General Michael Adams, not in uniform, not behind a podium of rank, but simply as a man, once profiled, once handcuffed, now standing before his neighbors to speak not for himself, but for all who had been unheard for far too long. He looked out over the crowd, faces old and young, black and white, many of whom had walked past him weeks ago without a second glance. Now every eye was locked on him. "I'm not here tonight to ask for your sympathy," Michael began, his voice steady. "I'm here to ask for your courage. Because if we don't face uncomfortable truths together, bias, fear, mistrust, we'll never build anything worth standing on." The room fell silent. A woman in the back clutched her purse tighter. A teenage boy leaned forward, eyes wide. An elderly man in the front row stood up. "General Adams," he said slowly, "I've lived in that neighborhood for 30 years. I thought we were better than this. I want to believe we can be." Michael nodded. "So do I, but belief must come with action. It's not enough to be not racist. We must be anti-racist, not just in words, but in how we vote, how we speak, how we treat one another." Next to speak was Officer Ramirez, his voice a bit uncertain, but filled with sincerity. "I used to think good intentions were enough," he admitted. "But General Adams made me realize silence can be just as harmful as violence. I want to do better, and I know others do too." Applause rippled through the crowd. Not thunderous, but honest. Sergeant Smith then stepped up. "We're implementing new training, reviewing policies, holding officers accountable," she said. "But we need your voices. We need to hear when we fail and when we succeed. This isn't us versus you. This is us with you." A young woman raised her hand. "How do we stay involved?" Michael answered without hesitation. "Show up to meetings, to conversations, to moments where someone is being treated unfairly. Ask questions, hold people accountable, and never assume it's someone else's fight." By the end of the night, something had shifted. It wasn't just a forum, it was a reckoning, a renewal, a promise. Residents lingered afterward to thank Michael, to share their own stories, to shake hands with officers they'd once feared. Outside, the night air was cool, but the mood was warm. Michael stepped onto the sidewalk, heart full, not because everything had changed, but because something had begun. And this time, the community was walking with him. Life has taught us that being seen for who we truly are doesn't always come easily. The story of General Michael Adams is a powerful reminder that even in a seemingly civilized society, prejudice can still hide behind polite smiles in quiet neighborhoods. One glance, one assumption, and a man who served his country with honor was treated like a threat. But what stands out is how he responded, not with anger, but with dignity, patience, and grace. This is the lesson that never fades with age. We are never too old to teach respect, to model fairness, and to guide others toward justice. Our years have given us wisdom, and with that comes a responsibility to speak out when something is wrong and to lead by example when others fall short. For seniors especially, your voice carries weight. You've seen the world change, and now you can help it change again, this time for the better. Differences aren't threats, they're bridges. When we embrace each other with compassion rather than suspicion, we plant the seeds of a better world. And even in our later years, we still have the power to be the roots of that change.